Okay. So if you guys remember from the other day, we talked about the effects of sarcomere length and joint angle and velocity on force production. And so what this graph is here is an attempt to kind of three-dimensionally, by using three axes, to show the relationship between the kind of combined effects of length and velocity. And this will again be sarcomere length, okay, not joint angle, but sarcomere length on force production. And so what you can see is here we have on this particular axis, it's sarcomere length. Here we have velocity, okay, slow and fast, short and long, and then percentage of maximal force. And so you can kind of see by looking at all of this that as velocity, there's kind of a hill on this side, right? Like if you look at it in this particular graph, that at faster velocities, we're getting less force regardless of sarcomere length. Down here at these low, kind of slow velocities, we're getting much, much higher ones. And then throughout, regardless of our velocity, there's going to be some amount, right, of effect of sarcomere length that we're going to be able to get, depending upon how much change we can get in those things. And so you can look at it and you can make some sort of graphical model that tries to predict what all is going to happen, kind of what the overlay of everything is going to be here. Okay, that's all that's showing. And I just put it in there to try to illustrate to everyone that, remember, all of the things that we've talked about that contribute to force production don't happen in a vacuum. They're all happening together simultaneously all the time. Okay, and we may be to experimentally kind of constrain things where we're going to force you into an isometric contraction, so we're going to remove velocity, or we're going to force you into an isometric contraction at a particular joint angle so that we can basically we can remove velocity and joint angle and any change in sarcomere length that might also kind of go on. Although when we measure that in the lab, it's isometric, but the muscle's still changing length a little bit, and so that'll freak you guys out. A last couple of things here before we talk about integration of sensory input into things is this idea of muscular power, okay? And I won't spend very much time on this. I just want you to appreciate that there is an equation, okay, that we can use. So from a physics standpoint, power is force generation or load that you're moving multiplied by velocity, okay? And so when we talk about athletes, a lot of times we are going to be very interested in power and maximizing power, because you are generating some force to move the load that is your body at a particular velocity. And so for you to run faster, you have to generate more power, because in theory, right, your load, your body weight is the same. And so kind of the application part of things for athletes is very, very much about, can we maximize power? More power helps us run faster, more power helps us jump higher. And there are kind of specific ways that we might want to try to train both force generation, but also velocity generation in an effort to maximize power, okay? So if you do the math on all of this, okay, and we look at and we multiply sort of force at a given velocity, the ability to generate force at a particular velocity, what you get is, if the force velocity curve looks like the solid line here, then the power curve is not exactly the inverse of it, but it is going to be flipped in a lot of ways. Whereas at very, very low velocities, okay, you may have high force but not much power because velocity is very, very low. At very fast velocities, you're not going to have a lot of force, so again, power is going to be very low. But typically in most kind of the average person, peak power output is going to occur around about 1/3 of peak velocity, okay? And so you're gonna have to just think about that. If you want to train for power, then you need to think about how fast, what's my peak velocity of movement, and do I want to train somewhere kind of around all of that to try to make it better. There's some very good evidence that if we do certain kinds of training, if you do power specific training or plyometric training where you are working specifically on moving a load as fast as you can, okay, training the nervous system to contract in this particular way, that we can shift this power curve to the right, okay? We can shift it to the right. And we can make it taller, but we can also shift it to the right so that you can get more power and more force at these higher velocities. Okay, and that may be something that's very beneficial if you're training actual athletes, not just people that are wanting to do like weight training or a fitness competition, or where they're just caring about what body composition looks like or those things. But if you're a basketball player or a baseball player or a volleyball player or anything else, and then where you got to run and jump and do all of that, then this is going to be really, really important. One of the other really big issues as it surrounds power is going to be fiber type. And so because fast twitch muscle fibers can generate more force and they can contract faster, it is really beneficial for generating lots of power to have lots of type 2 fibers. Okay, and so I don't really want you to look at and care about what's going on before and after a taper in this. I just wanted you to kind of see that this is a theoretical one that was from an exercise phys textbook with kind of slow twitch, type 2A, and then what they were calling type 2B, which is really type 2X. And then here's some from actual athletes when they have type 1 MHC, so slow twitch fibers, and then here's their 2As basically. And the curves are slightly different. The peak power is going to occur at a slightly kind of lower percentage of max force on on type 1s than it is on type 2s, but there's going to be a little bit of a difference. Okay, so again, this is why if you want to be a good sprinter, you want to jump high, you need to have, it's really, really beneficial to have lots of type 2 fibers, and we can't train that. Okay. One last thing on sort of the, it's interesting as the nervous system does things on the effect of task on things. So here are some data on, I believe this is Newton meters for what we're getting. This is going to be on knee extension, okay? And they're having people do, in the open circles here, they're having people do a simultaneous two-leg knee extension, and then they're having them do unilateral knee extension with each leg, and then adding those values together. And what you can note is that pretty much throughout every velocity at which we're moving, there is what we call a bilateral deficit. And that means that when you're doing a movement with both limbs simultaneously, you're a little bit weaker than kind of the sum of what each leg could do all by itself. And we think that's related to the way the nervous system is going to try to contract everything, and things like that. So just again, this may be why, when people jump off of 2 feet simultaneously, we got to train them a little bit differently than if we're going to jump off of 1 foot, and things like that. So the way the system functions is a little bit unique. Okay, so the last couple of things that we're going to talk about before we jump into the critical thinking questions are these ideas of muscle spindles and the ideas of what are called Golgi tendon organs, okay? And so these are very commonly referred to as muscle receptors. And so they're going to be the structures that are either within a muscle or in the tendon, near the muscle, okay, and for the Golgis, that are going to sense something going on in a muscle, and they're going to send feedback back to the spinal cord, back to the level of the motor neuron, and then on up to the brain. And both of these two things have the ability through reflex actions to either increase or decrease the excitability of the alpha motor neuron, and use that to then, or of alpha motor neurons going to the muscles that are contracting and their antagonist muscles, and we can use that to either enhance or inhibit things. Hold on just a second. It sounds like Leslie and Ellis are yelling out here in the backyard. Let me go take a peek really quick. Okay, all appears well. There apparently was an airplane flying over, and Ellis was yelling at the airplanes. She loves airplanes. So muscle spindles are special kinds of muscle fibers, okay? And their job is to sense the length of a muscle at any given point in time, okay? They are a collection of these mini muscle fibers that we're going to call intrafusal fibers. So intrafusal fibers come in two distinct types or two flavors. They're what we call nuclear bag fibers and nuclear chain fibers. Excuse me. And there are typically going to be from kind of a very small number to a very large number of these things. I think some of the lowest reported is about 6 in some of your smaller muscles, all the way up to maybe 12 or 1300. And so the interesting thing about muscle spindles is they have both sensory and motor innervation. And so what that means is that they have receptors. They're able to sense a change in length and then send a signal back to the spinal cord, okay, to tell it something about that change in length. And then they have what are called gamma motor neurons that are going to connect to them. And so that the gamma motor neurons mean that the nervous system actually has the ability, if it wants to contract or relax the length of the muscle spindle in addition to kind of the other fibers that are around it. And so as you guys will see with this, what can happen is if you chronically stretch or you chronically shorten a muscle, then the nervous system will alter the input to that spindle from the gamma motor neuron, which means that it will then alter the sensitivity of that muscle spindle. It will alter the sensory sensitivity to any kind of a change in length, okay? And so if it wants to make it more sensitive to a change in length, then you can increase gamma motor input, and that kind of stretches it out and makes it more taut. So any small change in length will get a bigger signal. Or you can kind of relax the gamma motor neurons and it will relax those two things. And so you've got to have a bigger change in length to evoke any kind of a thing. One of the ways that we can deal with this and we can manipulate this is by doing like vibration of a muscle or of a tendon. We can kind of trick the muscle spindles. Okay. So here's what a muscle spindle is going to look like. It's these little fibers that are interspersed with the other ones. And what you will note in the midst of all of this is we have these blue nerve fibers. Okay, there are these blue little fibers here that are connected to what's called the 1A afferent axon. So a 1A afferent axon, actually most of those, if you were to look in any nerve bundles, like in your elbow or your knee or someplace, the 1A afferent is a larger, its axon is larger in diameter than your motor axon coming down. They tend to be very, very big. But then it also has these red, kind of this red axon that's coming down that are going to have these little, what are going to look like regular neuromuscular junctions. And so as you stretch the muscle, it's going to get sensed and activate kind of the movement of the fluid in these nuclear bag and nuclear chain fibers that will activate 1A that will send a signal back up to the motor neuron. And then if we need to, we can also then send signals down the gamma motor axon, and then we can alter the length of these little fibers to help us kind of change the sensitivity of our system. Okay. So how do spindles signal? What's their importance? Why does all of this matter? Why is Dr. Black wasting your time with this? Okay. So to activate a muscle spindle, we need to stretch a muscle. Okay. We need to change the length of a muscle. We need to stretch it. As it stretches, the spindle stretches. That activates the 1A afferent. The 1A afferent is going to go from the muscle to the spinal cord, and it is going to synapse directly on what we call the homonymous motor neuron. And that means that if you stretch my bicep out, so I stretch my bicep out, that 1A is going to go and it's going to directly, okay, it's going to directly attach to the motor neurons that are going to send signals to my bicep, okay? And so this is going to help us do two things. Okay, one, 1A signaling to the homonymous motor neurons are going to make those motor neurons easier to depolarize. And that is going to allow us to hopefully, from the same signal coming from your brain, by making it easier to depolarize those motor neurons, then more of them will depolarize and we're going to get more force in the bicep. The function of that is I'm stretching it, okay? Somehow the brain knows if we stretch this too much, it might stretch and break or pop my muscle or a tendon. We could injure ourselves. So it thinks, ooh, we're stretching. Make it easier to fire those motor neurons so we get more force in an effort to try to keep it from stretching further. Okay. In addition to that, okay, we're also going to get signals that are going to come back, and they're going to, 1A is going to also synapse on the motor neurons of the antagonist muscle. So if it's talking about my bicep, it's going to come back and it's going to synapse also on the motor neurons that go to my tricep. And whereas they lead to easier activation of the bicep, they actually will make it more difficult to depolarize the antagonist motor neurons. So you're going to inhibit the antagonist muscle and sort of activate or make it easier, excite the agonist, okay? So the job of the spindles are to, ooh, we're changing length too much, shut off the tricep that would help force me down, no tricep force, more bicep force, so that I'm gonna go ahead and move up, okay? These spindles are active all the time, and they're one of the ways that they allow us to sense our position in space, okay, when we're moving, and allow us to make these very small corrections on how much force we're getting from a particular muscle. Okay. All right. So a very common way to test how the muscle spindles are working is the Tendon Tap Reflex. So if we were in class, I would sit down and I would whack my Achilles, got to whack my patella tendon. You can do it on the Achilles if you want, and you hit the tendon pull and stretches the muscle. The muscle then signals back to the motor neurons for your knee extensors. They're going to contract and it's going to kick forward. Okay, that's how the tendon tap reflex is going to be evoked. Okay, we can measure this experimentally. I actually, in my lab, we have a tendon tap hammer that has a force transducer in it, and so we can tap your tendon at these increasing amounts of force and measure the activation, like measure the EMG signal coming from your knee extensor muscles. We can also do some other things that are going on. We can do that like before and after vibration, before and after a bout of exercise, before and after stretching, and we can kind of see some changes. We can also directly stimulate the 1A afferent and send a signal up the 1A afferent, and then see how much force we're going to evoke out of your muscle. Or we can measure kind of a signal coming out of them, something called the H reflex, which we've done a few times as well. So there's some ways to kind of experimentally look at all of this, because there's lots of stuff that can alter how your spindles are processing things.
Dr. Black?
Yes.
Where's the gamma motor neuron? Like, is it just kind of separate from the...
They're going to be located, Callie, in the same place in the spinal cord as the alpha motor neurons. They're just going to be like, you'll just have like, alpha, 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 and then interspersed around them, there will be gamma motor neurons that are going to be there. There's a bunch of other kind of neurons in the spinal cord that are also going to be near that. They're called interneurons. There's some things called Renshaw cells that primarily function to inhibit a bunch of things. And so your spinal cord has lots of neurons in it. So I'll just say that.
But the purpose of that is so the spinal cord can directly signal the muscle spindle.
That's right. So as you guys will see in a couple more slides, one of the things that goes on is there's this idea of something called common drive, which means that the brain cannot you can't send an individual signal. You can't conceive of sending an individual signal to each individual alpha motor neuron all the time, and you can't individually gradate how much signal the brain is sending to each one of those things. And so the way that it gets handled is that the brain sends some large excitatory stimulus down, and then once it gets into the spinal cord, then based upon feedback from a host of things that are going on, you can either allow that same signal from the brain to get you more or less force based upon how much spindle input there is, how much Golgi tendon input there is, where you are from other proprioceptors in space. Are you fatiguing? Are you experiencing pain? A whole host of different things. And so it's this, the brain says big signal, and then we can use all this other input to kind of closely modulate it at the level of the spinal cord, because it's just too complex for the brain to be able to kind of top down all of that stuff. Okay. Okay, so Golgi tendons in some ways signal in the opposite way of the muscle spindles. So Golgi tendons sense force rather than length. And so they're going to be located in, as you would imagine, in the tendon, kind of right distal to the muscle, kind of in the early part of the tendon, well before the insertion. And as you generate force, you stretch those collagen fibers in the tendons and they smish the nerves. And as you smish those nerves, then that's going to activate the Golgi tendon. And so the Golgi tendon, because in this instance, high force might lead to muscle damage, the Golgi tendons are actually going to inhibit force production in the agonist muscle and lead to an increase in force production in the antagonist muscle. So it's that signaling is the opposite of the way the spindles are. So I'm lifting a really heavy weight with my bicep, lift, 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 lift. Too much force where we may rip the muscle or damage the tendon. So Golgi tendon gets activated, signals to the spinal cord says, bicep, shut it down. Tricep, turn on. Put this freaking weight down, okay? Stop trying to lift it. Okay. There is some thought that when you hear people that perform these kind of superhuman feats of strength, lifting cars that they could never lift otherwise, like off of people that are in trouble or the car has fallen on, that maybe one of the things that you're doing is in these extreme situations, you're able to completely kind of counteract the functioning of your Golgi tendon organs and kind of release this safety mechanism and generate more force. What they don't tell you is that lots of those people that pick the cars up off of people, they do that and they put the car down, and the next day, like they've just destroyed themselves in some ways because they're really, really damaged because they generated so much force. Again, you can train the Golgi tendons to be less active. One fun thing to do is you can have people get in a squat rack, give them a weight that they could never actually lift like up concentrically, just have them like help them unrack the weight and have them just stand there in the squat rack with the weight, re-rack the weight, do that a few times, and they'll actually be able to get stronger. They'll be able to lift more by doing that, because just holding that very, very heavy weight somehow demonstrates to the nervous system that we can do this, and we're not going to just completely just shred our muscles. So then it will turn down the activation of the Golgi tendons. So some really interesting stuff there. More difficult to measure Golgi tendon activation than it is spindle activation. They signal through the 1B afferents, and it's much more difficult for us to kind of isolate the individual effects of those things. So, okay. So the last slide that I have here, I just want you guys to kind of appreciate how complex all of this is going to be. So every time you contract a muscle, you are getting this descending corticospinal signal, right, from the motor cortex that's going to come down, and it's going to act at the alpha motor neuron, and then the alpha motor neuron, if it depolarizes, will send a signal down to our muscle fibers. Well, one of the problems, though, is that the alpha motor neuron, it has a resting membrane potential, and we can get either a excitatory like, so the white circles are excitatory inputs, the dark circles are inhibitory inputs. And so like here is group 1A. So you've got 1A afferent. So signals from the muscle spindles are going to excite the alpha motor neuron, making it easier to depolarize. So for any signal coming from here, we're going to get more motor neurons that will depolarize, and we're going to get more force. Okay, well, you're getting signals from there. You may also be getting signals from this 1B, which is the Golgi tendon, and the Golgi tendon is going to directly inhibit the alpha motor neuron. It will also inhibit the interneuron that is being getting input from 1A, and so there's some interactions that's going to be there. You have these spindle group 2 fibers that are some other signals coming that may lead to excitation. You're going to have signals from group 3 and group 4 afferents, which will sense hot, cold, okay, chemical environments, pain, those types of things. They may have direct effects where they excite certain things that then excite things that inhibit things, and then that's going to inhibit the alpha motor neuron. You have these things called Renshaw cells that are always putting inhibitory input in there. And then on top of all of that, all of these things here and Renshaw, all of these things are also going to transmit signals up to the brain. And then if the brain needs to, the brain will send descending input not only to the alpha motor neuron, but to all of the neurons that are going to handle the signals from this. And so the brain can then crank up or down the excitability of the things that control the excitability or inhibitory controls into the alpha motor neuron. And if at this point you haven't like gone to sleep and gone cross-eyed, then good for you, because it's amazingly complex. Okay, it's amazingly complex. And yet magically it all seems to work. Okay, it all seems to work. And so just remember that when you're going to get training adaptations later on in the semester, there's going to be a lot of things that can happen that can let us recruit more alpha motor neurons or fire our alpha motor neurons at a slightly higher firing rate, or things that are going to inhibit the antagonist muscles when we're doing a particular lift. One of the ways that you get stronger at doing a squat is to shut off the hamstrings that are trying to co-contract against you initially to provide some kind of support and stability at the knee, but you can shut those off. So it's very, very complicated, this idea of sensory and motor integration. I know just enough to be conversant and dangerous, but there's a lot of people in the neuroscience field that know and study and manipulate a whole huge amount of other things. Okay. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing that. And now I'm going to open the learning objective for
Dr. Black.
Yes.
I kind of have a question about the Golgi tendon organ and muscle spindle fiber.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I was, is there, so kind of like what you said, the Golgi tendon organ is able to blunt the effects of a muscle spindle, right?
It can, sure.
But then you can downregulate the Golgi tendon organ through training.
Yes.
Okay, that's what I was making sure I had that right in the mind. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, with training, you can alter spindle sensitivity, you can alter Golgi tendon sensitivity, you can alter the interaction of the spindle and the Golgi tendon sensitivity. And, you know, I think that the important thing from a take-home standpoint for most people is just that when we do training, typically we're going to make it easier to excite kind of the net inputs going into our alpha motor neurons. They're more excitable than they were previously, and that's why people are able to have higher levels of recruitment and a little bit higher firing rates. Okay. From y'all's purposes, I think that's, at least right now, that's probably a good way to think about that, rather than trying to, okay, well, I'm getting this much from Golgi and this much from Spindle and this much from this, and kind of, I mean, it is the net total of all of those, but, you know, with training, you're just going to get better at it. Okay. Cool. Okay. So let's do some critical thinking. Who wants to start? Anybody want to volunteer? Should I ever do class like law school? We're going to do the Socratic method, like somebody's on the spot every day. Like today is Jacob's day, and he must answer all questions at all times for things. That just seems kind of like mean in some ways, but you never really know. Let's do this. So, Alex, do you want to take the first crack at the first question? So, pennation reduces the amount of force, right? Yet almost all muscles are pinnated. Why do you think there might be some advantage to being pinnated, and explain your answer?
So my general idea on that was, if you have two different muscles on two different parts of the body that have the same size, it wouldn't always be beneficial to be able to produce the same force. So I just got curious and looked up a few different size of muscles and realized that, for example, the sartorius and the biceps, for example, have pretty much almost the exact same size on average.
Okay.
But being able to produce the same amount of force with the biceps is not as necessary as it is with, I think, any muscle that is around the quad or responsible for extension in any sort of form. So that was kind of the base idea of where my mind went with that.
Okay. Okay. Keldon, what about you? What'd you come up with?
I kind of so I kind of read it wrong as well as
It's okay.
I went back on to being able to fit more on the tendon. I completely read that wrong. But being able to fit like more muscle fibers onto the tendon, and
no, that's perfect, Keldon.
Okay.
I
didn't know if that's what we were asking about, but yeah, being able to fit more on the tendon and not more reduces the amount of force, but you're able to per fiber produce more pull on the tendon.
Okay, so with what Keldon was talking about, Megan, what are we making bigger? Pennation allows us to make what particular parameter that we talked about larger?
Cross-sectional area?
Any particular kind of cross-sectional area, Megan? Maybe you said it, I just missed it at the very start.
Like the physiological cross-sectional area?
Perfect, perfect. Okay, so, and this gets into what Alex was saying as well. So pennation, in most instances, allows us to have a larger physiological cross-sectional area, which allows us to get more force out of the same kind of overall volume or size of a muscle, right? If you've got the sartorius and the bicep that are basically the same size, but one is more pinnated than the other, that one's going to have a larger physiological cross-section and therefore potentially be able to have more force. Okay, so let's go a little bit further. Okay, Callie, do you remember which muscles in the body tend to be, no, let me ask this in a different way. Which muscles in the body do you think it is most important to be able to generate the most force from?
Like the most force? I mean,
Yeah. I'll ask it a third different way. Which muscles in your body are the strongest? Like if you had to pick, which muscles are the strongest?
probably your like upper thigh muscles, your quads
Okay.
and your hamstrings.
Sure. My quads, my hamstrings. Okay. Why? So we can make an assumption, right? Even though that we're probably several hundred years from removing any sort of natural selective pressure on sort of our body types in some ways. But conceivably at some point, there's a reason that humans look the way that they do, that we don't look like tigers, or that we look different than even say like orangutans or gorillas or something, right? Like we, even though we may be bipedal and those things, we look a little bit different. Our quads are the strongest muscles. Why do you think that's the case? What is the advantage? Why are my arms not my strongest muscles in the body?
I mean, your quads have to like support your entire upper body, and you're using, like, you were built and designed to move.
Right? We were, sure. Or to move at least in a way that we typically do, right? Okay. Good. Good. So we use our legs to walk. We use our legs to run and jump and those kinds of things. And so, it makes more sense that those might be the bigger muscles. Now, if we were quadrupedal, then our arms might look a lot like our legs. Like, look at your dogs, look at your cats or something, and have Alex turn around, even though his are clearly not under a lot of natural selective pressure there, right? You get a little dog leg. If you were to look, like, their front and hind legs are probably much closer in like actual size than our arms to our legs, outside of the bros that never squat, right? The never squatting bros, real big, real top heavy, like Mr. Incredible up here, and then little bitty toothpick legs, right? Those bros, they may not be the case. So good. So I just want you guys to think about all of that. There's usually a reason that things are the way that they are, okay? And we did talk about the chance that when you do training that pronation may change, right? And that change is going to let us either hopefully pack some more muscle in, to get more force. Okay. So we'll kind of, I'm just moving down the list here on things. Ryan, why does it feel easier to run downhill?
Okay, so I had wrote, like, at first I thought it was like more about like gravity, but then after we had like the last like 2 lectures, the cross bridges, you're not using as much energy to go downhill, and so the cross bridges are what make it easier. We use less energy, and so it's like mostly an eccentric movement, and so you're not having as much of like, it's not as metabolically taxing, and so you can like detach the cross bridges a little bit faster, if I like kind of grasp that correctly. So I think it's easier running downhill just because it's easier. You're using less CO2, like the CO2 response is lower, and then it's just all coming from the cross bridges. Like, you're just going quicker, and like you're not using them as much.
Okay, that's right. So you don't have to cycle the cross bridges as often during an eccentric contraction. Okay, and so anybody ever run like a bunch of hills, or like run downhill a bunch, or you've gone hiking, like maybe not here in Oklahoma, but in a place where there are actual mountains, and like you've gone up a lot, but then you had to come way like down a bunch, and you end up with your quads and maybe your calves being very, very sore the next day. That's because those kinds of things are eccentric contractions. In some ways, every time you walk and take a step, your quads, when you get them out and you get to heel strike with your foot out in front of you, your quads are going to do an eccentric contraction to break your fall. Like when you're running or walking, you step forward, and then gravity wants to make you kind of fall forward, and then you put your leg out to stop that, and then eccentric quad contraction. And so when you run, there's more force that has to be generated. You're going boom, boom, boom. As the steeper the downhill, more of all of that. Okay? So Pearson, so if that's the case and it costs us less energy, if we're going to go run a race, let's say I'm a cross-country runner, okay? A lot of cross-country runners, like they have cross-country meets on like golf courses and things. In many ways, that I feel like it's all like this is the perfect white people sport, right? It's kind of like lacrosse or something, right? Like we're gonna all go play golf, and then we're all gonna run on the golf course and these things. But I'm gonna run a cross-country race. Let's assume that it's somewhat hilly, okay? If I want to do my best in this race, when should I try to run the fastest? At what points in my race might I want to do that, and how might that relate to kind of the energy use that Ryan was talking about?
I would say you'd probably want to try your hardest and use go as fast as you could when you're going downhill.
That's right. Yes.
Less energy is used, and when you're going up hills, try to save as much energy as you can so that you're not just out of energy for the rest of the race.
Okay. No, that's a very, very prescient answer. Anybody ever run cross country? I ran today at lunchtime, and there's some little baby hills in our neighborhood. And what is people's natural inclination to do on a downhill?
Slow down so you don't fall.
Okay.
Would be me. I'm just clumsy though.
Okay, I was gonna say I wasn't worried about falling necessarily, but now that's something else we got to think about, Ryan. But why else do people tend to slow down on the downhill? What are they doing?
I never ran cross country or anything, but just in general out exercising, whenever I see a downhill, that's kind of my excuse to get lazy and
Yes, good, Pearson.
take it easy.
People rest, right? Because this feels easier. I'm gonna rest on the downhill because it's not as hard. And so I might make the argument that if you're going, and this will make more sense after we do some metabolic stuff, that maybe what we should be doing is if you ever have to run a race against people, when you get to the downhill, sprint on the downhill. And then that way you're actually using less ATP to sprint while you're going downhill. Other people are resting, make up some time there, right? You're not generating as much metabolic byproduct because it's not using that much energy. And then go back to your regular pace rather than resting on a downhill. Use the downhill to speed up, kind of lean into it, and then go back to your regular pace on the level ground or on the uphill. That seems to me like that might be a reasonable strategy in that way. I don't like to go fast ever under any circumstances. I was really pushing myself today. I ran 2 miles, and I actually got my second mile to be under a 9-minute mile pace. I could go faster, but man, it just sucks. And I was pretty pleased with myself. So anyway, but none of it was fun. It was all terrible. I need more downhills. And I was thinking on my last, as I'm coming to the end of my second mile, I'm like, ooh, here's a downhill. My instinct is to slow down. My instinct is to, like, I've just been going up this uphill. My legs are burning a little bit. Like, I want to rest. And I have to tell myself, like, no, just keep going. Just keep going. Just keep going. So my wife does the opposite in some ways. She goes faster on uphills than anything else. I call her a race walker. We like to walk. We used to, before we had Ellis, we would like walk half marathons, and we walked a marathon once in honor of her mother. Never walk a marathon. It's too fucking far. And you're out there, like, you got to train. You have to like practice going that far. You got to go walk for like 7 hours. You're like, man, this whole day is shot. The good part was that's an instance where you do burn enough calories that we would go and do like, we did like 22 miles, and then we would go to Outback and get cheese fries and like 3 loaves of bread and chicken fingers and things. And she would get steak. We would go celebrate. But she goes faster on the uphill. I call it ramming speed. She tries to speed up while we're going uphill. And I hate it. And I try to explain to her the science about why it's wrong. And she just rolls her eyes at me. And it's like, I fell asleep. Your science is boring. Let's go. with all of that. So that probably tells you all you need to know about our relationship on those kinds of things with everything. So, okay, very good.
Can I ask a question about eccentric contractions?
Of course, Callie.
So I was just confused. Like you said, they don't engage cross bridges as much. So do they engage them at all, or just very little?
Okay, great question. Great question. Okay, so I'm going to do an example here. Let me arrow back up so that you guys I can see myself and what y'all can see. Okay, I have my Diet Mountain Dew bottle here. Okay, I am going to curl my Diet Mountain Dew bottle. All right, the bottle has some mass because of gravity. It has some amount of weight. So in order to do this curl, I have to engage just enough cross bridges, right, to allow the power stroke to generate just enough force to overcome gravity and allow me to move this thing up, right? We can all agree on that? Okay. Now, when I want to lower it down, okay, what's going to happen is I need to continue to engage some cross bridges, otherwise my arm just flops, okay? I must stay with some level of contraction, but there's two things that are going on here that will allow me to not have to engage quite as many cross bridges to lower down the thing that weighs the exact same. The first of those is that I'm wanting to lower it, so I'm wanting to let gravity win, okay? So I need to generate just a little bit less force than what gravity is exerting on my bottle so that I can allow it to get lowered down towards the earth. I'm letting gravity win, okay? So I can disengage a few cross bridges because gravity is going to win, all right? So now to lower it, even though it weighs the same, I'm using fewer cross bridges. Also though, okay, because when I do an eccentric contraction, all I have to do is engage the cross bridge, okay? And because the eccentric contraction is independent of velocity, it just engages and it holds on and it generates its force. And then we just turn a few of them off, and then that just lets us lower it right back down. Whereas when I'm coming up, okay, I've got some cross bridges that are actively engaged that are generating force, while I also have some that have released and are going back to their high energy state so that they can then reattach and help me generate more force. So I've got to have, some of them are always detached and cycling on the way up, and they're not on the way down. So I have to have a larger proportion of things to help me go up and a lower proportion when I'm going down, okay? And it's just because they're engaged, but they don't have to break apart and go back into the high energy conformation nearly as often. So because they don't have to break, we don't have to bring the ATP in and use the ATP to break them off. That's why we use less energy to do eccentric contractions. And that's why we need fewer, okay, fewer cross bridges engaged to lower a weight than have to be engaged to pick the weight up, okay? Does that make sense, Callie?
Yeah, it makes sense. But they do break off, just not as often. Just
not as often, that's right.
Okay, cool.
Sometimes they have to break off because if they don't break off, they've gotten, you know, it's on and they're getting stretched some, and at some point they got to let go or they may get stretched so much that they rip, okay? And so that's the other problem of doing eccentric contractions. And we don't really talk about it very much in this particular class, but eccentric contractions cause muscle damage, okay? So anytime you've ever been sore, you have these little micro tears in your muscles from doing eccentric contractions. Most of you are not sedentary enough, is my guess, that doing a concentric or an isometric contraction would cause damage. But it's the eccentric contractions. It's always the down portion on the curl. It's always the down on the squat rather than the up that is causing you to stretch those muscles while you're loading them. You're going to rip some of the cross bridges apart, and that's going to cause some damage. But you can also envision a situation whereby if I don't have to engage as many cross bridges to lower a weight down, the same weight that I'm picking up, I don't have to engage as many cross bridges, then you can imagine if every cross bridge or every muscle fiber is like a rubber band, and there are more of them that are engaged, then I've got a thicker rubber band. So I'm picking it up, I got a big thick rubber band. When I'm going to lower it down, that rubber band is not nearly as thick, and so there's a much greater chance that it's going to get stretched out and break. Okay, and that's why also, if you need to, you can generate 20 or 25% more force. So if you do these maximal eccentric contractions, you're getting way more force than you ever can. They can be high force, and you use less of them because the nervous system strategy is a little bit different. And so you place a very, very high, what we call specific force, or force per active number of muscle fibers engaged on those fibers during eccentric contractions. So that's the thing. And of course, that's one of the things that if you want to at times come down to my lab, we do that on purpose to people. We make you sore on purpose by doing eccentric contractions. So, and sometimes we turn your muscle on artificially by using electrical stimulation, which bypasses the Golgi tendon. And so we're shutting down all of the inhibitory mechanisms, and we can really blow up some fibers that way. But that's a different discussion for a different day. That was part of what we did for my doctoral dissertation. So, okay. All right. So I was going to ask Megan, as we get near the end here, how might I be able to get a relative estimate of muscle fiber type by studying muscle contractile properties?
I feel like there's multiple ways depending on like the equipment and stuff you can use. So
Okay.
like what I wrote in my answer is that, there's basic tests of if somebody has more type 1 or type 2, where are they able to produce a lot of force once or twice, or are they able to produce a little bit of force a lot over a certain weight? But I know we discussed like surface-based electrodes, the non-invasive way of kind of seeing how those electrical signals are sent throughout the muscle, and using equations to determine if they have more type 1 or type 2 based on the electrical signal sent through. And then lastly, I was discussing this with Callie, looking at the time to peak contraction. It's different between type 1 and type 2. So type 2 will reach it quicker than type 1. So if you're able to measure that, you can kind of help use that to determine as well, loosely.
Okay. So Jacob, what Megan just said about time to peak tension is absolutely correct. Why is it correct? What is it that is different? What is it that's faster in the fast twitch muscles than in the slow twitch muscles?
Yeah, so I have it in my answer. I gotta close my screen really quick. Hold on. Okay, so when you're doing the tension to peak tension test, you're kind of being able to see like how fast the myosin ATPase is able to break and pretty much create that peak tension.
Good.
Knowing the speed of that, and so type 2s have faster myosin ATPase than type 2, or type 2 faster myosin TP. I mixed it up.
I know where you're getting at. Okay, good.
And then I also was talking about how you also have the half time to relaxation, which is kind of more so about how fast can the circa take back up the calcium.
Okay.
And I know that type 2 can take it up a lot faster than type 1, which is also why you're able to pretty much go faster, activate quicker, and get force faster than type 1. Yeah.
Okay.
My brain is mush today.
No, that's okay. That's good, right? So what I hope that we can illustrate with this, and this is, I think, a really important thing when I give you critical thinking questions, is how are you approaching trying to determine what an answer might be? So I'm asking, right, like, how can I get a relative estimate of fiber type by studying contractile properties? So to me, what that means is we need to start at, okay, well, what are the things that determine fiber type? Like, what is it that's different about the actual fiber types? Let's go to that place first. Okay, they have different myosin ATPases. They have different circuits. Okay, well, so what would the myosin ATPase, what does it actually do during contraction? What does circa actually do during contraction? And then think about if that was faster or slower or different, then what might that plausibly make, what would that change as we look at all of those things, okay? That's the way that I think we should approach these. And so it sounds like, Megan, you and Jacob did a really good job of kind of getting at those particular things, because you're talking your way to, okay, it's the myosin ATPase that's this, or we're talking our way to circa and it's going to be this, okay? Good deal. All right, so for the very last one, we actually, in my answer to Callie's previous question, we did a little bit of stuff about why the eccentric contractions can generate more force. But what I need now is I need a volunteer. Can I get a volunteer?
I'll volunteer. I don't know what for, but I will.
Okay. Megan, can you stand up and get the webcam on yourself so that I'm going to have you do something. You're going to do a move. So, okay. You were laying down in bed. Now you're standing up. All right. Here's what I want you to do, Megan. Everybody watch Megan. I want you to try to jump as high as you possibly can. Okay? One more time.
Hit the ceiling. I don't know. Well, can't go further.
Ah, did you? Okay. Jump and do that again, please.
I won't use my hands because that's what hit the ceiling.
Whatever you got to do. Okay. Megan's got lots of hops. Thank you, Megan. Okay. What did Megan do as part of her jump that we might be able to take advantage of to get more force during eccentric contractions? That might be part of the reason why you can lower more weight down than you can ever hope to pick up. Anybody want to guess?
I guess she descends and uses a stretch shortening cycle.
Okay. So, Alex, was that you? I can't even see you.
Yeah,
there you are. That was you. Okay. She did a descent, right? So before she went up, she stretched her quads, right? Why? So we're doing a stretch shortening cycle. So she stretches the quads, she lengthens the quads before she shortens them. What does that do? How is that giving us more force going up? You'd never jump without doing this. You'd never want to, like, if I told you got to fight somebody, you'd never like punch like this. You want to go back farther and then punch, right? I'm going to be honest with you. I've only ever punched one person in my entire life. We were like 10 and playing wiffle ball in his backyard, and I was pitching and he charged the mound, so I punched it. The only fight I've ever really been in. So I've never been to a boxing class, so y'all can make fun of my punching ability. But what's doing when we stretch? What's happening?
Doesn't it store like energy in the tendon? Like that's how cats can jump really high because they have really long tendons.
Okay. What kind of energy is it storing, Callie? You're absolutely right.
I think it's potential energy.
It is potential. I was going to say it's elastic energy,
okay.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, once you've stored it, it is in fact potential energy. That's absolutely correct, right? But so your tendons and then your muscles also have connective tissue in them. Connective tissue functions like a rubber band, and when we stretch it, it's going to want to be able to go back to its original shape, and so you've got to input some extra energy into it as we stretch, and so it stores all of that, and so then when you let it go, you're going to get extra force from that stored elastic energy. And so when I sink, I store some elastic energy. I may also put some calcium on or phosphorylate the light chain of my muscle fibers, of the myosin heads, a little bit there as well. But I'm going to stretch, I'm going to store energy, so then when I release in the other direction, I'm going to get more. So when I'm going down, I can get whatever force I can get from all of my cross bridges being engaged. So they're generating force, so that's going to let me lower that way. But also, as it goes down, I'm storing more and more elastic energy, which is trying to keep this thing. It doesn't want to go down. That elastic energy is trying to keep it from falling. It's like hanging it on a rubber band. And so you got to get a bigger and bigger weight to be able to actually stretch it out in that instance. So that's the other reason why we can get more force out of eccentric contractions. Okay. All right. How did y'all do on that one? Did anybody get stored elastic energy? No? Anybody have a particularly fun idea that you would like to share with the group?
I looked a little bit because I wasn't quite sure and found a good few studies on the role of tighten in that. Tighten detaching and almost acting like a spring.
It does also do that, yes. So I think I told you guys way back on one of the very first days that we now know that tighten can independently generate force that's independent of myosin, and especially during lengthening or stretching, like eccentric contractions, that tighten very often will also try to generate some force there. So good, very good, Alex. I have a PhD student coming in the spring, and he's really interested in tighten. And like, could we measure tighten and do some things in people? And I have, I don't know. We got to try to figure out how to do, if we can do all of that or not. We can get somebody to come take some biopsies and look at tighten. So there we go. Okay. All right, guys. Do y'all have any questions about anything?
How do we get the critical thinking questions to you?
Just email them to me would be great, Alex.
Okay.
A couple of you guys already have, but then the rest of you guys just go ahead and shoot them to me in an email. I'm gonna try to get all grade things entered this evening. I spent Ellis's nap time editing one of Grant Chesbaugh's papers that we're doing together this afternoon, and I was writing notes on it on my Surface with like the stylus, and I saved it, and then I sent it to him, and none of the things that I had written on there had apparently actually saved. And so I was sitting on our front porch cursing a lot that I'd spent like an hour and a half making suggestions and doing things. And so I'm like, Grant, just call me tonight and we're going to talk about it, because I'm not going to all the trouble to write that shit again. So anyway, okay, I'm gonna stop